She was barefoot, and she called him sir. Then she asked, "Sir, can I have your leftovers? My sister is starving." It was late afternoon in the mall parking lot, the kind of hour when the sun thins into a pale gold and everyone seems to be checking their watches. Cars hummed, doors clicked, someone was laughing in the distance on a cell phone ad. Ricardo had one hand on the steering wheel, the other juggling his briefcase and his phone. A meeting he couldn't miss sat blinking on his calendar like an accusation. His shoes were glossy enough to reflect the sky. His tie was not perfect. His mind was already 15 minutes ahead, rehearsing figures and phrases he would deliver in a glass room filled with people he barely knew. He was a man who prided himself on timing. Punctuality had been the backbone of the life he'd built. Then a small voice stalled his rhythm. "Sir, sir, look under the car." The voice wasn't one of the usual parking lot calls. It had a thin, urgent quality, the kind children use when they need to be heard over the noise of the world. Ricardo glanced up, annoyed for a heartbeat, annoyed at being delayed. A barefoot girl stood between two SUVs, a scrap of faded pink dress clinging to her knees. She cupped both hands around a tiny paper parcel, steam lifting from the top like a two was trying to make itself known. She was anywhere from 5 to 7, wide-eyed in that candid way children are when they haven't yet learned to guard their gaze. Ricardo moved to the curb out of reflex rather than intent, the way you step aside for a stranger so as not to impede them. The girl darted past his car, then crouched and tucked the parcel beneath the shadow of his tire as if hiding treasure. Two older boys nearby barked a laugh and pointed. A glint of menace moved through their posture. For a second, everything in Ricardo's world narrowed to that little brown parcel and the way the girl's fingers trembled as she smoothed the paper down. He bent. The scent hit him first. Warm dough, fried oil, a faint whiff of shredded chicken and small, bright spices. It was a smell that traveled from a street cart or a small deli, something humble and honest. She had hidden a coxinha, a savory Brazilian pastry, a little cone of shredded chicken and dough fried until golden, under his car as if wrapping it in the safety of metal. It was absurd and tender and suddenly very real. "Why'd you put it there?" Ricardo asked before he could stop himself. His voice came out flat, the corporate polish slipping for the first time. The girl blinked, then looked at him in a way that made his defenses soften. "They were going to take it, the boys. They take our food when they can, so I hid it. My sister, she gets so hungry, she cries. I can't make her cry." She pushed the parcel out with both hands toward him. There was pride in her movement, and also a careful offer, as if she were giving him something too precious to spend. Ricardo's hand hovered. He had been raised to keep his meals neat and to leave nothing behind. His childhood had been a different hunger, softer but no less present, the hunger for approval, for stability. He thought of his daughter, Leah, now 12, sleeping in another city with her mother, with whom he'd arranged staggered weekends after the divorce. He thought of how time had become the rarest currency in his life. He bought care, tutors, the kind of comforts that fit in invoices and itemized reports. He had always assumed that generosity was measured in checks and pledges, not in sharing a greasy pastry on a cracked curb. "Take it," he found himself saying before logic caught up. "No," she replied, surprised. "You look hungry." There was a light frankness to the way she said it. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't begging in the way the adults on the overpass beg with practiced lines. She was offering a transaction defined by dignity. She would give, not because she had nothing, but because she chose to. Her chest heaved slightly, a child's movement, all of it making Ricardo absurdly protective. "Why would you give it to me?" he asked. She watched him for a long moment, like she was counting the honesty in his face. "Because maybe you look like somebody who can change things," she said. And the words were so simple, so blunt, that they landed like a stone in water and rippled out. "And because my sister needs it. Please? My sister Mia. She's small. She sleeps with the blanket with the tear. She cries for bread." Ricardo felt the world tilt. The meeting pulled at the back of his thoughts, a persistent alarm. But this voice, this small, urgent hand, had a gravity that argued for a pause. He opened the paper. The coxinha was warm, the crumbs still crisp, the stuffing soft and slightly oily when he pinched it. He split it in two with his fingers, the pastry yielding with a tiny crack. The girl's mouth opened in an expression half surprised, half pleased. They ate quietly, standing between cars as the parking lot exhaled the everyday. He handed her the smaller half. For a second, the world narrowed to hot pastry and the tiny steam that lifted between them. When they finished, Helena, that was the name on her chipped enamel bracelet,
tugged at the hem of his suit jacket to thank him, then dropped her gaze and kicked at a little stone. "What's your name?" he asked, unable to help himself. "Helena," she said. "Helena and Mia. My grandmother's name is Nusa. We live by the big bridge, under the tarps." The words were soft, each one a small shipment of fact that arrived more like a confession than a complaint. Ricardo felt an odd kinship with the names. They fit into a pocket of his memory where other names sat. His mother's, his daughter's, the old neighbor who taught him to tie knots. There was an intimacy in names. They made people more than silhouettes. "Do you want me to—" he started, the sentence dissolving in his own mouth.
What could he offer? Money? A sandwich? A ride? 100 different logistics opened and closed like boxes in his mind. He was a man who solved problems with resources, but this immediate need, and the way the child's eyes tracked him, felt like an unscripted test. "I have school tomorrow," Helena said offhand. "The teacher gives stickers. I want to go." Ricardo lifted his gaze from the scuffed pavement to the mall doors, to the columns where shoppers streamed by. He could hand her a card, a note, an IOU. He could continue to his meeting and check the whole episode into the neat drawer of his conscience labeled Good Intentions. Or he could listen to the ache the memory of his own daughter's face had suddenly become. "Come back tomorrow," he said finally. "Same time?" Helena smiled like the promise of something rare. Yes. There was no fanfare when he drove off. The meeting was a blur of slides and voices and polite applause. At the table, Ricardo's suit had a faint smell of fried dough that no luxury cologne could drown out. An hour into the presentation, he asked a question that surprised the room. Data trends, yes. But he asked it with a softness in his voice that made colleagues glance at one another. He left the conference early, apologized as if a private emergency could be packaged into an email. And when the elevator dropped him back at ground level, the afternoon sun had already shifted further west. Before he climbed into his car, he checked his phone, then stopped, fumbled in his jacket pocket, and pulled out a paper bag. Inside were sandwiches, a thermos, a pair of wool socks, a small stack of napkins. It was an unplanned, clumsy offering. He drove to the spot where yesterday's interaction had happened and found in the same place the small handprints of other lives. A stray plastic cup, a child's shoe wedged between concrete seams, a scrap of cardboard that fluttered in the wind. Helena appeared without fanfare, a small figure in the golden light. "You remembered," she said simply, and handed him the parcel she'd eaten down not as a test, but as a duty fulfilled. "Open the bag," he said. He watched her face while she unwrapped a sandwich, the way the corners of her mouth softened when she realized there was a thermos of cocoa too. Her joy was not the spectacle of some viral clip. It was the modest dilation of relief. As they shared, he learned the names of the people who filled her day: her grandmother, Nusa, her sister, Mia, the two older boys who took what they felt was theirs. He learned that they kept their blankets under a tarp near a viaduct, that mornings were a scramble for what others left behind, that evenings smelled of car exhaust and fried food sold at a corner stand. He learned that Helena had a small ritual of smoothing her sister's hair before night, as if passing on a blanket stitched with trouble. When he left that day, he told himself he would stop by again.
If you like stories like this, if you want more moments that remind you how small acts can be large, like and subscribe. There are more to come. That night, Ricardo couldn't sleep properly. He lay awake listening to the distant urban hum and let his mind fill the gaps with scenarios. There was the memory of a kitchen years ago where his mother served rice and dried fish, quiet as a church, the smoke lines braided in the ceiling. There were the years immediately after his divorce, when he had learned to calculate love in scheduled visits, and to read tenderness as a thing with a deadline. And there was Leah. At 12, she had started asking awkward questions about stability, and whether houses could be lost like toys. Ricardo had always considered himself pragmatic. He was not a sentimental businessman by any common measure. But the way Helena had split a pastry with him had felt less like charity and more like an initiation. He bought more than sandwiches in the days that followed. He bought a blanket with a thermal liner, a pair of children's shoes, a small battery-powered lamp that would not be stolen if left near the tarp. Each purchase felt improvised, as if he had been temporarily deputized into a role he hadn't applied for. The more he gave away, the more the ledger of his conscience softened. Yet every time he approached the viaduct, he felt a thin tug of unease, the kind that comes when one knows there will be consequences for stepping beyond one's customary borders. Helena's grandmother, Dona Nosa, did not appear at first. On the third day, when Ricardo arrived early with soup that smelt of cumin and coriander, he found an older woman sitting on a stack of plastic crates, sleeves rolled, stirring a tin cup of coffee. Her face was maps and histories. Her hair was tied into a bun that had once been smooth, but now had the defiant frizz of someone who had spent years facing wind. She looked up with eyes that had seen people come and go, with a dignity that did not beg. "You're the man with the suit," she said. A simple observation, neither accusation nor praise. "Ricardo," he answered, offering his hand. Dona Nosa took it in a grip that was both firm and warm. She smelled faintly of the spices she had used that morning, and of a detergent that tried its best against grime. She thanked him for what he brought, then turned the conversation quickly to logistics. "We do not want pity," she told him. "We want to be seen, not gawked at." It was a sentence that landed with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing dignity in hard places. Ricardo felt shamed by the reflexive flutter of relief that came with being thanked. He had pictured himself in various roles: benefactor, patron, anonymous donor. He had not imagined being answered so plainly. Over the next 2 weeks, his visits became a rhythm.
Monday, soup. Tuesday, school books he had found at a donation pile. Wednesday, an inspector's mini-kit of Band-Aids and hand sanitizer. Each visit smoothed the rough edges of acquaintance into something like obligation, and then affection. He learned that Dona Neza had once worked as a cook in a small neighborhood inn, had married young, had buried a husband who left debts and small newspapers with obituaries in the margins. She spoke rarely of the past, but when she did, the stories were not lessons. They were slices of life. How she learned to knead by moonlight because the day was for work. How her hands remembered heat. Helena, for her part, converted Ricardo into a kind of confidant with the delightful economy of children. She taught him how to balance a paperback book on his knees and asked him to draw letters with a twig on a scrap of cardboard. She was serious about stickers at school and painstakingly optimistic about the idea a teacher once mentioned that learning could be a ladder out. She had a toothy grin that hinted at missing baby teeth and a stubbornness about her braids that made Ricardo smile in ways he had forgotten were possible. He began to bring little things with him: a second-hand book of fairy tales, a small set of colored pencils, a raincoat with sleeves that could be rolled up. The community of workers in the nearby lots began to recognize him. Some nodded in cautious approval. Others watched from a distance. He noticed, too, that his colleagues at the office became aware, not because he announced anything, but because his schedule began to have small blank spaces for the custody of this new duty. He kept notes on his phone, not spreadsheets, but short reminders. Find winter shoes for Mia. Ask HR about volunteer days. Get a proper mattress for tarp to bed conversion. It was during one of those mornings that an incidental problem crystallized into a policy question. He had arranged a small delivery of cleaning supplies to the tarp, and word had traveled back to the office via a chirpy message from Silvana in HR. She was an efficient woman with a dry humor and a talent for detecting when something might need paperwork. "You can't just bring people into the office grounds without a formal plan," she said, tapping her pen against a folder. She was patient with him in a way that suggested she dealt with impulsive generosity often. "We have liabilities, we have security, we also have a shelter policy." "It isn't a shelter," Ricardo said, partly defensive, partly still not sure where to draw the line himself. "They're neighbors. The grandmother can cook. The girl wants to go to school." "Then do it right," Silvana replied. "If you want to help, we can help you help them, but it's got to be done through channels. A formal offer, a job description for the grandmother, some paperwork for temporary placement. Otherwise, the company gets nervous." The word nervous carried with it all the bureaucratic weight of 1,000 potential problems. Ricardo understood perfectly the vocabulary of corporate caution. He also understood how some urgent needs evaporate under the weight of policies. He left the meeting with Silvana feeling both encouraged and deflated. Encouraged because she offered a pathway. Deflated because every pathway required the kind of institutional patience that moved slower than hunger. Then came Marcelo. Marcelo and Ricardo had been partners for years. Marcelo was a man who believed systems were the answer to human messiness. He could reframe a problem into an efficiency chart and then defend that chart with a kind of loving coldness. He always preferred a diagram to a story.
When Ricardo first broached the idea of helping Helena and Dona Nesa in a more structured way, proposing a short-term stipend, a clean room and storage for weather, the possibility of hiring the grandmother as a cook for company events, Marcelo raised a brow so precise it read like a legal brief. "We're not a charity," Marcelo said. "We have stakeholders, we have a balance sheet, we're accountable." Ricardo tried to translate his experiences into pragmatic language. "It's about retention, Marcelo. It's about culture. This can be a pilot program. It can be framed as community engagement." Marcelo's laugh was soft but had the edge of someone clearing cobwebs. "You think a sandwich and a mattress will change corporate culture? People eat pastries every Friday. People donate their old coats. This is not scalable unless it has clear KPIs and measurable outcomes." Ricardo swallowed. He felt the familiar friction between lived compassion and corporate metrics. He was not naive about the necessity of planning, but he did not want to allow planning to become a dead end where human beings were left on the pavement because forms were missing their signatures. "Do what's right," he said finally, with the kind of pleading that had nothing to do with spreadsheets. Sometimes scale starts with small things. Sometimes one relationship changes the fabric. Marcelo shook his head. "You're letting one anecdote lead strategy. It's dangerous. We need policies. We need due diligence." Ricardo knew Marcelo's concerns were not vicious. They were the muscle memory of an institution that had to keep running. Still, the conversation planted a seed of unease. It suddenly felt like his good intentions had weight and consequence, and that weight could be wielded either to lift people or to crush the very spontaneity that made the help meaningful. That night he returned to the viaduct and found Helena laughing at a makeshift game she had invented with Mia. The sisters were inventing worlds on a cardboard stage. The older boys who had once menaced them were watching, bored, but not interfering. Helena ran up to Ricardo and pressed something into his hand, a piece of cardboard with a crude star drawn in blue pencil.
"For you," she said, "so you remember." He kept the star. It lingered in his palm like a small unpaid debt. Back at home, alone in an apartment too tidy for his restlessness, he set the star on the dining table and let the room gather the shadows. He thought of the ledger of good deeds his mother had kept in her heart, the small, unreported kindnesses she made into a life. He thought of the dissonance between his public reputation and this new private claim on a child's life. The days grew colder. A rainstorm moved through the city that felt like a reprimand. On one particularly wet morning, he found the tarps sagging underwater, and the small cluster of possessions seemed to sit in a miniature lagoon. Helena's feet were muddier than usual. When he offered to buy them boots, she looked at him with suspicion, as if new footwear might be a trick. "Boots get stolen," she said simply. "Then let's buy 2 pairs, Ricardo proposed, trying to reach a compromise he had no playbook for. Dona Neusa laughed, a sound like dry leaves. "We survive on very little. We also survive on pride. Choices matter." The word choice returned to him that night like a chorus. Dignity versus pity, planning versus improvisation, immediate relief versus sustainable change. He began to see that the work he had stumbled into was not a short campaign. It was an incision into the assumptions he'd built his life on. It was at once tender and inconvenient. Silvana's email about liability sat in his inbox as a polite reminder that any action would need to be justified to more than his conscience. Marcelo's caution whispered from the boardroom. And on the other side of these institutional murmurs were Helena's small hands and Dona Neusa's film crib, and the tidal fact of hunger. One afternoon, in the small quiet between meetings, Ricardo found himself drawing out an outline on a napkin. There were columns and timelines, funding sources, and a sketch of the storage room behind the company kitchen that could, with minor repairs, become a safe, dry space for a small family member on occasion. He imagined a rota of employees bringing meals, a temporary stipend for the grandmother while she worked, a part-time contract that would be drafted carefully to keep both dignity and security. He took the napkin and folded it into his pocket like a prayer. The first step, he told himself, would be a conversation with Silvana to map feasibility, and then, he did not like to admit this, a quiet, persuasive meeting with Marcelo where he would try to convert fear into structure. When he arrived that evening under the viaduct, Helena had a small clay dish in her hands.
For you, she said, so you remember when you were brave. They had begun to exchange gifts of a sort, not jewelry or trophies, but things made hastily and given with sincerity. Ricardo felt the weight of the clay in his palm, and the weight of the coming meetings pressing on his shoulders.
He was tired in a way that felt like confession. He was also undeniably energized. As he walked back to his car, the city lights were just beginning to flame on. Somewhere, a bus sighed. He thought of the meeting with Marcelo and of Silvana's cautious sanction. He thought of Leah and wondered if there was a way to translate what he was learning into something his daughter could see without it feeling like a lesson planned by the adult world. He thought of how small choices had lodged into his chest like new constellations. He promised himself one thing before he slept, that he would not allow corporate caution to extinguish the ember that Helena had placed under his tire. The question then was how to translate that ember into a fire that could warm more than momentary bellies. In the days that followed, multiple small scenes unfolded. Ricardo sitting with a mug of coffee and filling out a volunteer form online, Helena bringing a sticky drawing of the sun to hang on his office wall, Dona Nesa offering a small, perfectly rolled empanada to the receptionist, who took it with a surprised smile. Each gesture changed something imperceptible in the fabric between the office and the viaduct. Employees began to notice. Some asked quietly, others watched with corporate curiosity. Ricardo could feel the gentle drift of culture beginning to tilt, as if a new gravity had introduced itself between two parallel lives. Yet tensions grew too. Marcelo had begun to collect questions, each one a fine-toothed comb through Ricardo's good intentions. Who's responsible if she gets sick on company property? What about liability? Is this our place to intervene? Marcelo's concerns were not wrong, and Ricardo knew that. The issue was not the questions themselves, but what the answers would allow them to become. One late afternoon, he asked Michaela in security, a woman who had been at the company longer than Marcelo and who kept a small pot of basil on her desk, what she thought about the idea of setting up a safe, temporary place for Helena and Mia. She looked at him with a practical kindness and then said, "If you've already started, finish it right. Don't let it be something that can be taken away. For kids, that's worse than never having it at all." His plan was changing from improvisation to intention. He would not simply stroll in with sandwiches and leave. He would make a plan that could withstand policy and skepticism. He would sketch the edges of a commitment, a room with a lock and a curtain, a part-time contract for Dona Nesa to cook on certain days, a liaison in HR, arrangements for school enrollment. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start that could be defended in the boardroom. The evening before he planned to present a preliminary proposal to Silvana, Helena placed a small paper star atop his already creased napkin. "Keep it," she said, "so when you talk to the big people, you remember the small ones."
He carried that star into a meeting room and set it beside his laptop. When Silvana read the outline, she nodded slowly. "It will require minutes, a budget line, and security clearance," she said. "But if you're willing to authorize the time and the funds, I can draft the paperwork." Ricardo felt like a chess player making a move he could not yet fully visualize. He approved the initial budget. The next step was Marcelo. He scheduled the meeting for a Friday at 4, hoping fatigue would soften resistance. Marcelo arrived with his usual quiet precision, his shoes leaving small crescents on the carpet. Ricardo unfolded his napkin plan, explained the logistics with the same clarity he used in presenting quarterly goals, but there was an intangible difference. This one had a child star next to it. Marcelo read the plan, his gaze sharpened. "Are you certain this is not a PR gamble?" he asked. "And what do we do if it backfires? What about other families? What precedent are we setting?" Ricardo felt a sudden rush of frustration. The words were reasonable, precision-driven, but they felt like a sieve under which humanity could fall through. "This isn't PR," he said. "This is about a relationship. We can scale what works. We can create transparency. If we set standards, do checks, have contracts, there will be accountability. But the alternative is to let people continue to sleep under tarps while we file memos." "Accounts demand metrics," Marcelo replied. "People demand compassion. Both can exist.
But you need to realize you're asking the company to bear a cost we didn't budget. Where will the funding come from? Who will monitor outcomes? Ricardo met the questions with the only thing he had, a stubborn conviction earned in the space between what he wanted to be and what he had been. I'll fund the initial phase myself if I have to, he said. I don't want to go public with it yet. I want a pilot. If it works, we'll talk about company involvement. If it doesn't, we close it cleanly. Marcelo folded the plan, the creases like verdicts. He didn't say no. He didn't say yes. He said, draft the proposal. I'll review. But understand this. We protect the company, and we protect our stakeholders' interests. And with that, the meeting ended. The napkin folded back into Ricardo's pocket like a fragile treaty. On his drive home, the city glowed in the kind of thin, metallic light that made the puddles look like mirrors. He thought of the pilot as both a chance and a risk. He had stepped into a moral problem without a manual, and now he would have to write one on the fly. The star in his pocket was warm against his fingers. He thought of Helena's face when he'd offered to bring boots, and of Donna Noosa's steady gaze when she had told him they did not want pity. He had a list now: mattress, shoes, permits, contracts, school enrollment forms. He had allies in unexpected places: Silvana's bureaucracy, Michaela's pragmatic heart.
He had resistance too, and Marcelo's careful doubt, and the company's need for predictable outcomes. As he pulled back into the parking lot where this whole thing had begun, he saw Helena waiting under the viaduct, her silhouette a small dark figure against the concrete. Mia clutched a threadbare doll. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and frying oil. Helena waved. He stepped out and walked toward them, the draft of a plan still folding inside his mind like a map. He knelt to Helena's level, and she presented him with a new gift, a small paper boat. "For the rain," she said, "so it won't drown." Ricardo smiled and felt something nearly untranslatable, a mixture of fear and determination, like the moment before diving off a high ledge and trusting the water. He didn't know if the next steps would be applauded or criticized, if the pilot would survive bureaucracy or be swallowed by it. But he knew this: the star and the boat and the shared coxinia had already altered him. They had made a quiet claim on his time, his resources, and his name. At the edge of the viaduct, the two boys watched, their expressions cool, bored, almost respectful. In the distance, there was the muffled honk of a taxi. Somewhere, his phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for a quarterly forecast. He let it buzz. When he finally drove home, the napkin star lay on the passenger seat, a small, stubborn constellation that refused to be folded away. The story was only beginning. He kept driving for a few blocks with nothing but the city lights and the paper star warming his palm. The napkin plan in his pocket felt less like improvisation now, and more like a promise whispered into being. When he returned home that night, he unfolded it again and smoothed the creases, laying out the small columns of tasks, as if arranging soldiers for a campaign that would have to move with care. The first weeks of the official pilot were a blur of small victories and paperwork. Silvana drafted a simple contract for a part-time cook position, 3 mornings a week, paid with basic workplace protections, and arranged for security to perform background checks for anyone who would need access to the converted storage space. Ricardo cleared a small line item from his own discretionary budget to cover the initial repairs and supplies. Michaela negotiated with facilities to allow the use of the dust-free corner of the back area, one with a window that could be fitted with a curtain for privacy. It took forms, signatures, a cautious nod from legal, and the kind of patient explanations that make compassion sound like compliance. Donna Noosa read the contract once and then laughed softly, folding the paper into her apron pocket like a recipe. "So now I am official?" she asked, amused, no small measure of pride showing through. "They'll pay me to cook, and I have hours like a proper worker?" "Like any other," Ricardo said.
He watched her face carefully for the flash of humiliation he feared, but what he saw instead was satisfaction, a seam of dignity tightened by being recognized as a working woman again. She insisted on a small probation period. "If I am to cook for people who wear ties," she told Ricardo with a crooked smile, "then I will do it properly." Not everything moved smoothly. 2 neighbors complained about increased foot traffic near the storage entrance, and security requested that access be limited to set times. There was a brief scare when city inspectors questioned whether a family could be housed in company property even temporarily. The wording of municipal codes was muddy, and bureaucrats loved mud. Ricardo found himself answering emails late into the night, forwarding photographs of a mattress placed on a raised pallet, diagrams of the curtain division that would create a private sleeping area, and a letter explaining that the goal was temporary stabilization, not permanent encampment. Marcelo hovered like a careful shadow through all of this, asking pointed questions and requesting updated budgets. His tone never turned cruel. It remained the tone of someone who believed the world ran on measures and timelines. When the first quarterly audit came through his office, Marcelo ran his finger along the line where Ricardo had written "Initial funding, private." He asked whether Ricardo intended to keep that commitment if the pilot expanded. "If it helps people find a path," Ricardo answered, "I will keep funding until we can transition to a sustainable model. But funding is not the only point. We need rules that protect them and protect us." Marcelo nodded. "Rules are shelter too," he said, his voice like the sound of a clasp closing. "Make them clear." There were afternoons when all of the bureaucracy felt miles away, when the world reduced itself again to a shared thermos and the way steam fogged tiny fingers. Elena and Mia continued their rituals, sharing the blanket with the tear, smoothing the doll's hair, rehearsing the songs their grandmother hummed. When Ricardo arrived with a battered shoebox full of donated school supplies, Elena squealed and opened each pencil as if it were a new planet. Mia clapped when she found a pink eraser with a smiling cat on it. The materials arrived like small credentials for a life that insisted on being ordinary. One morning, after a late-night meeting with legal, Ricardo found Helena on the curb selling little paper boats she had folded and decorated with colored pencils. "For the rain," she said, offering him one. He took it and found, tucked inside, a small note, "Thank you for the cochinia." His throat tightened at the childish handwriting, the loops of letters like little promises. He asked where she had learned to make boats so neat. "From Dona Nesa," she replied. "She sometimes makes them when it rains. She says boats are for traveling, even if you can't leave."
The storage room conversion became a project in small domesticities. A donated mattress was raised off the concrete with pallets. A thick curtain was hung. Hooks were installed for coats. A tiny lamp gave the space a homey glow after dusk. Ricardo brought a rug that had seen better days, but held in its fibers the warmth of another life. And Michaela stitched a curtain with a floral pattern that read like a mother's insistence on color. There was an argument, brief and human, about whether to install a lock. Security insisted. Dona Nusa demurred at the idea of being locked in. In the end, they agreed on a coded latch. Enough privacy to keep out bothers, but not so impenetrable it felt like a cage. When the company kitchen first filled with the smell of Dona Nusa's cooking, people drifted like moths. The receptionist, who had never tried an empanada before, took a tentative bite and then returned with a second. A junior analyst who normally ate his lunch in solitude brought his sandwich to the communal table and ended up staying an hour later to hear a story about how Nusa once braided cassava into a bread when flour was scarce. Small conversations began where there had been polite nods. Someone started an informal rotation to bring extra desserts on Wednesdays. The transformation in the office didn't sweep everyone at once. It was a tide of marginal shifts that accumulated into warmth. At a board meeting, Ricardo presented an update. The pilot had shown immediate benefits: a stable presence in the lot, school enrollment paperwork in motion for Mia, a part-time contract for Dona Nusa, and detectable morale upticks in employee surveys. Marcelo asked for numbers: participation rates, cost per person, projected scalability. Ricardo offered both metrics and stories, and it was the stories that made the boardroom air change. One young manager spoke up unexpectedly about how his grandmother had taught him to cook when money ran thin. An HR officer said she had never considered inviting neighborhood members into the company, but now saw the program as a potential model for community engagement. Not everyone was convinced. A few clients asked politely if the company's philanthropic foray would affect performance. A member of the legal team warned that anything beyond temporary hospitality could invite liabilities. Yet through it all, the pilot quietly held to a principle: aid coupled with dignity, agency for those being helped, and a plan that emphasized transition rather than dependency. Part of that transition was school. Enrolling Mia required forms, an immunization record, and a photo ID none of them had. Ricardo spent a morning at the municipal office, clutching documents and listening to clerks explain the gaps. It was maddeningly procedural.
Stamps here, witness signatures there, and it required patience he had to borrow from somewhere deep.
When the enrollment was finally accepted, when a date for the first day of class arrived, Helena and Mia lay awake the night before, whispering about stickers and the risk of losing a pen. On the morning they walked into a real classroom, the sight of them in small uniforms with backpacks too big for their shoulders felt like a small theft of sorrow, as if a grief had been moved one seat down the table. There were setbacks. On a Thursday, when a storm hit harder than forecasted, a runoff sent a thin stream through the tarp and soaked a box of books. Two employees who had been reluctant to engage now found themselves helping to dry pages in the break room. When Ricardo arrived, he found Dona Neusa standing ankle-deep in damp cardboard, scolding the weather in a tone more practical than furious. "Weather," she said, "is nothing but bad timing. We will fix it." They did, with a tarp raised higher, crates placed on pallets, and a small donation drive among staff for waterproof storage. Marcelo's stance softened over time, not because he yielded a principle, but because he began to see the program's edges. He started attending informal check-ins and posed practical questions that actually improved the project. An outline for a clear termination clause for the pilot, performance indicators for the part-time role, a budget cap. He never stopped reminding Ricardo of risk, but he also began to offer suggestions that made the pilot sturdier. It was a shift like a metal becoming tempered, not melted, but reshaped. 6 weeks into the pilot, an incident jolted them all. A delivery truck had to reverse near the storage area, and a passerby complained to security that they felt uncomfortable with people loitering. Security, frightened of liability, briefly suggested removing the sleeping arrangement entirely until they could produce additional approvals. The notice arrived like a cold wind. For a moment, Ricardo felt the old reflex of retreat: contracts, checks, margins. Then he remembered Helena pressing the paper star into his palm and Mia sleeping with the torn blanket. In the face of a bureaucratic shove, the human stake felt too sharp. He called a meeting that evening with Silvana, Michaela, and the security chief. He argued for a calm, evidence-based response, better signage for the area, a schedule of authorized hours, a roster of staff volunteers to ensure predictability, and a rapid application for the municipal waiver that would legitimize temporary accommodation. They worked late. Silvana drafted a report that highlighted the social benefits and mitigation steps. Michaela organized a roster of employee volunteers to be on site at defined times. The security chief agreed to place a welcome protocol that included a de-escalation policy and a clear line to the HR liaison. The next day they held a community meeting under the viaduct. Ricardo spoke, hands clasped, words precise.
He explained the temporary nature of the arrangement, the steps they were taking to ensure safety, and the goal, to stabilize a family enough for school and work. The two older boys who had once menaced Helena came, not to cause trouble, but with a curiosity that felt fragile and tentative. One of them asked what would happen if the pilot ended. "Then we will have to find a better next step," Ricardo answered. "And if we cannot, we'll work together to find other people who can help." When Helena offered to help small neighbors fold pamphlets for a bake sale the company agreed to host, Ricardo watched her crouch beside a folding table, fingers moving deftly as she learned an adult rhythm. The bake sale raised enough to buy a proper rainproof box that week. The small victories were not dramatic. They were the quiet accumulation of a communal world putting itself together. As the pilot solidified, it began to affect Ricardo in private ways. Leah, his daughter, noticed change first in the way he came home at odd hours, smelling of coffee and spices rather than cologne. He tried to explain without making it into a lesson. One Saturday, he invited her to visit the converted room under the pretense of a community day. She arrived wearing headphones down around her neck, 14 now, with an eye for authenticity. They walked together to the viaduct, and as they approached, Helena ran to them, breathless with the news that Mia had learned to read a new word. Leah watched quietly while Ricardo introduced her. Helena offered Leah a paper boat, which Leah accepted like an ambassador. They spent the afternoon painting signs for a small mural to be installed in the company courtyard, a gesture Ricardo had proposed and the employees had embraced. Leah's face changed as she added a blue stroke to a painted wave. There was no sermon in the exchange. There was only the simple currency of presence, and for Ricardo, that was more than enough. The mural became a turning point. It was painted on a wall that had once been purely decorative, a rectangle of concrete between the cafeteria and the parking lot. Employees volunteered a Saturday to bring ladders, paint, and lunch. Dona Neusa cooked a pot of stew, while Helena and Mia handed out paintbrushes to anyone who wanted to try. The image was not elaborate, a child handing a pastry to an adult, both figures rendered in broad strokes,
a coxinia stylized into a golden sun. Beneath it, someone painted in neat black script, "Small hands, big changes." On the day of the mural's unveiling, people gathered. Marcelo stood off to the side with a paper cup of coffee, watching with a look that mingled skepticism and something gentler. The CEO, who had not been involved from the start but had been carefully briefed, walked through the crowd, eyes tracing the painting.
She listened as employees shared short testimonies. A receptionist who had gained a friend in Dona Nuisa, a financial analyst who had been taught how to roll dough in return for help editing his resume, a janitor who had been included in the rota and discovered a new appreciation for the way people could treat each other. When Helena stepped forward, barefoot but carrying a small foil-wrapped package, the crowd drew in like a tide. She held the package toward Ricardo with both hands. "I made this," she said simply. "For you." The package contained a cosigna, her own version, small and slightly uneven, but made with intention. The gesture was not theatrics. It was an offering of skill. She had watched her grandmother. She had learned the roll, the sealing, the subtle press of thumb and forefinger that made the pastry hold together. She had made it as a gift, not as a payment. Ricardo knelt down to be at her level. The crowd quieted. He accepted the cosigna, broke it, and tasted it. It was imperfect and perfect at once. Slightly salty, a touch of spice, the dough warm and homemade. When he raised his head, there were tears in more than one eye, including his own. The mural behind them, the painted sun, caught the light and seemed to glow. "You don't have to," he said, his voice small. He meant the pilot, the funding, the messy logistics. He meant the life his choices had started to make. She shrugged, a child's nonchalance. "I wanted to," she replied. "You gave us a room where we could dry our books. You gave my sister a pencil. You came back. People sometimes don't come back." His chest tightened. The truth of that sentence landed like a verdict. "I will keep coming," he said. "I promise." The ceremony moved into an informal celebration. People who had never shared a meal began exchanging recipes. The company kitchen, once sterile and utilitarian, smelled of frying dough and talk. Several employees signed up for shifts to help run a small community breakfast every Wednesday. The pilot had morphed into a micro-community center with clear guidelines, schedules, and companions. Months rolled forward, and the small project broadened its reach. A local nonprofit offered to partner, helping to formalize the educational pathway for Mia and provide social work oversight. They connected the family to a counselor and helped with the required medical records. The partnership meant more paperwork, but it also meant that the pilot could begin to open doors beyond company walls. Marcelo, who had been principally concerned with precedence, found himself penning a short note to the board specifying measurable outcomes: school attendance, employment hours, and community engagement metrics. He insisted on quarterly reviews and on a mechanism to handle grievances. Ricardo, who once feared being reduced to sentiment, learned to translate tenderness into proposals and compassion into spreadsheets.
It was not a betrayal of feeling. It was a pragmatic step towards sustainability. Dona Nuisa's part-time role evolved into something richer than a paycheck. She began to teach a small cooking class on Fridays for staff and neighbors, charging a modest fee that went into a communal fund for emergency needs. Her hands, calloused from years of kneading, somehow made the corporate canteen feel less formal. She baked a loaf one afternoon and handed a piece to Marcelo, who paused, then nodded with a ripple of approval that felt nearly like gratitude. Helena thrived at school in a way that made small triumphs accumulate into a different horizon. She brought home drawings of birds and numbers that looked like folded ladders. She learned to tie her shoelaces, a skill that made her strut like a little captain. Mia, who had at first been quieter, started to laugh loudly when a classroom joke landed. The blanket with the tear was mended and placed on a chair, where for a long time after, it reminded everyone of the work that had been done to keep a child warm. One evening, 6 months after that first split cocina, Ricardo sat at his kitchen table with a folder of reports and a small stack of handwritten notes. Each note had a name and a short observation. Mia attendance, 92%. Dona Nuisa's contract, stable. Community breakfast volunteers, 18. There were numbers that meant efficiency and health. There were also notes about intangible shifts. Employee empathy increased in anonymous surveys. More people took their breaks outside instead of at their desks. Colleagues who used to avoid talking to security now asked about their weekend plans. Leah came by that night. She had painted a small blue wave for the mural and had in her pocket a rehearsal of a phrase she wasn't sure how to say. "Proud of you,"
she eventually offered. Ricardo swallowed. There was a complicated tenderness to being told you were becoming someone your child recognized. He wanted to explain the gravity of bureaucracy and the vulnerability of small promises, but instead he told a story about a girl who hid a pastry under a car and offered it to a stranger. Leah listened, then asked if she could help with the Saturday breakfast. Ricardo found himself smiling as he imagined her at a table of ready hands. The pilot had attracted attention beyond the building. A local newspaper ran a human interest piece that framed the program as a company with a heart, a headline Ricardo accepted with mixed feelings. He didn't want the focus to be on his change of life or on his role as savior. He wanted the focus to be on the people whose lives had been steadied. But the publicity brought donations, volunteers, and offers from other companies curious about a model that worked on dignity. There were hard conversations that had to be had. The board debated whether to extend the pilot scope to other families. Legal cautioned that expanding without clear rules could invite chaos.
Some employees worried that the company would become a social service when its core competency was something else entirely. Ricardo argued for a measured scaling plan. Test, evaluate, partner with local social services, and only then consider expansion. He had learned the limits of unilateral action. He now valued collaboration. A year from the first meeting under the viaduct, they installed a small plaque near the mural. It read, in simple letters, "For the times one shared what they had, and in doing so, gave everyone more." There was no attribution to an individual. It hung like a communal signature. At the unveiling, Helena stood on a milk crate and watched as people who had once been strangers put their hands to the plaque. The sound of laughter rose like steam. On that afternoon, Helena presented Ricardo with another coxinha. This one was larger, perfectly shaped, the golden crust gleaming. "I made it for you this time," she said, eyes bright. "To say thank you." He tasted it slowly as the crowd watched, and the flavor filled the spaces between words. He felt gratitude that had the shape of obligation now, a promise to keep the work honest. If anything changed him more than the logistics, it was watching how giving reconfigured pride. He discovered that the privilege he had once thought of as currency was experience, the ability to be present, to witness small recoveries, to be accountable for them. He learned to sit with discomfort when outcomes were messy and to celebrate the slow increments as real victories. He also learned the cost of staying the course, evenings reduced, priorities rechecked, conversations about work and life rebalanced. There were moments of resentment at the demands on his time and a fear that he was overreaching. But those moments passed like storms, leaving a clearer air. Helena, matured by small responsibilities, suggested something one afternoon that startled them all. "We should teach the boys to float boats too," she said. "Then they won't be bored." It was the most practical kind of mercy, integration rather than exclusion. Ricardo found himself nodding hard. He arranged a session where the older boys were invited to the kitchen to learn to roll dough. The first attempts were clumsy. There were jokes and spilled flour. But after a week, one of the boys returned to the viaduct with a small bundle of rolls he had made and offered them to a neighbor with a shy smile. The gesture was small, but it broke a rhythm of antagonism and replaced it with reciprocity. The change was not and could never be complete. There were setbacks, bureaucratic slowdowns, and moments when the family considered moving to another city where relatives lived. But the pilot had planted seeds that could grow into something sturdier. School routines, legal work, community skills, paid work for Donna Nusa, and a company culture that now included an obligation towards its neighbors. On a quiet evening, Ricardo stood at the viaduct alone. The city sighed. He thought of the meeting he almost missed that afternoon a year ago, of the small voice that had called to him. He still felt the tug of the corporate world and the gravity of fiscal responsibility. But now something else had weight, the knowledge that a life could be altered by what seemed like a trivial choice. He could trace, like stepping stones, the sequence of small acts that had become a pathway. Stopping, sharing a pastry, returning, hiring, fighting gently with policies, enlisting colleagues, and finally building structures that allowed dignity. Helena trotted up, wiped her hands on her dress, and handed him another small boat she had decorated. "For your desk," she said, "so you remember not to forget us when the meetings get loud." He accepted it and placed it on the dashboard of his car,
alongside the napkin star he had kept all these months. The objects looked absurd together, a child's paper folding and a crumpled napkin, and yet they acted like anchors. He found himself thinking about what it would mean if everyone were just slightly more attentive to the small claims on their time. The mural remained, a visible reminder that gestures could be contagious. The company's Wednesday breakfasts continued, the community fund sustained minor emergencies, and Dona Nusa's classes drew a wider circle of participants. Helena and Mia progressed in school, and the tear-mended blanket rested on an armchair in the converted room, where nights were now quiet and secure. At the year mark, the company held a small celebration. Employees shared testimonials. A woman spoke about how the initiative made her reevaluate how she treated the people who cleaned the building. A young man confessed he had been inspired to volunteer at a local shelter. The chief of security talked about improved trust with the neighborhood. The CEO stood up and said simply, "We can measure profits in reports. We can measure impact in people." Her words did not dispel the complexity of what lay ahead, but they offered an official blessing that made next steps easier. In the middle of the gathering, Helena climbed onto a crate and read a short note she had composed. It was about small hands and big changes, but not a lecture, a thank you that read like an invitation. The audience felt its power because it was not performative. It had the authenticity of lived exchange. When the event wound down, people lingered around the mural, taking photos, trading stories, and offering to help with upcoming school fairs. Ricardo found Marcelo, and they stood together, silently watching a group of interns teach kids how to fold paper boats. Marcelo turned to him, and for the first time without a caveat said, "You were right about the small things. It was simple, it was enough." The story did not end with the mural, or with the hiring, or with the neat matrix.
It continued as a collection of tiny commitments, a repaired rainproof box, a child's homework completed under lamplight, a grandmother paid for her work, a company that learned to measure value in both revenue and human stability. There were nights when he still felt the old loneliness, the reflex that had once kept him moving from meeting to meeting, but now it was balanced by a companionable exhaustion that came from living with responsibility. Months later, long after the initial headlines faded, Helena pressed a small paper parcel into his hand. Inside was a coxinha she had shaped with her own fingers, the crust browned just so. "For your lunch on the long day," she said, "so you won't forget to eat." Ricardo smiled and tasted it, slower this time, noticing texture and spice and the way the crust crumbled in his mouth. He thought of how a single act, the quiet decision to split a snack, had unfolded into a community that kept showing up for one another. He thought of the boy who had once been a skeptic and now quietly brought a carton of milk to the breakfast rotation. He thought of Leah, who now painted waves beside him and volunteered on Saturdays. He thought, too, of how close he had come to driving away that first day, to fitting the encounter into the neat drawer of good intentions. He felt gratitude for the way small, persistent actions could create new structures, and humility for the times he had underestimated the patience required. He looked up at Helena and asked, "Are you happy?" She considered the question with the seriousness of a judge deliberating a small verdict. "Sometimes," she said. "Most times I am okay. And now when I get hungry, I know some people will come back." He had no epiphanies left to offer. There were only next steps, ensuring the family remained connected to services, encouraging Mia's education, maintaining the company's commitment, and protecting the dignity that had been cultivated like a growing plant. There would be forms and frictions and moments when the world asked for proof. But there would also be the ordinary human exchanges that accumulate into meaning. Meals shared, a pillow fluffed, a paper boat trailing on a puddle. As dusk fell and streetlights flickered on, Ricardo thought about all the Helenas we pass every day, the small hands that wave for attention, the quiet offers that risk pride to feed someone else. He thought about how tiny acts can ripple outward, not as grand gestures, but as patient consistency. He understood now that some rescued lives do not fit into a tidy headline. Sometimes the person who appears helped becomes the one who leads you back to what matters. If this story touched you, if you felt the tug of the small things in your own life, consider sharing it with someone who needs to be reminded that small acts matter. And if you can, support a local food program or neighborhood shelter. Those steady institutions are the scaffolding that can hold tiny, courageous lives as they climb.
He folded the last paper boat and put it, with the napkin star, into the pocket of his jacket. The objects were simple. They were enough. He drove home with the radio low and the knowledge that the choices he'd made would keep unfolding. Outside, the city kept moving. Meetings continued. Deadlines waited. But inside his car, a child's gift and a quiet promise had made a different kind of calendar. One measured in shared meals and in mornings when a girl could walk into school with a pencil and not the weight of hunger. He thought, finally, of how often we imagined saving someone else will be a dramatic, singular act. The truth he had learned was quieter. Rescue often arrives as the accumulation of small, steady returns. The one who comes back, again and again.